Hi everyone, today we're going to look at chapter 12, all about the central nervous system and specifically the brain. We're going to go through a couple of images just to refresh our memory about brain anatomy, and we're going to look at the different lobes of the brain, the functional areas of the brain, the meninges of the brain, the ventricles of the brain, and so forth. We'll start off by looking at this lateral view of the brain. There are a couple of features here that we have to identify. Firstly, as you can see, we have the cerebellum over here. This entire thing is called the cortex. Here we have a view of the brainstem itself. And then eventually the brainstem will be joined to the spinal cord itself, which will continue down through the foramen magnum to the rest of the body. In this view of the brain, lateral view of the brain, there are a couple of features that we have to identify. Firstly, this little sulcus over here is called the central sulcus. Now, why is the central sulcus so important? Well, the central sulcus is important because it helps to divide the different lobes of the brain. Before we even do that, let's define what a sulcus is. A sulcus is an inward folding and infolding of the brain. So you can see the cerebral cortex is highly folded. An infold, like here, let's just do it over here, that's a sulcus, right? And all the sulcuses have various names. We're only going to name the central sulcus. It's so-called central because it's centrally located, and it's the only sulcus that goes from one lateral side of the brain all the way to the other side. So when you rotate the brain on the other side, you can see the central sulcus goes all the way through. So sulcus is an inward fold of the brain. A gyrus is an outward fold of the brain. So all these little outward folds that you see over here, for example, this one over here, that's a gyrus. The gyri, which is plural for a gyrus, also have various names. We're not going to name all of them, obviously. So that's the central sulcus. The central sulcus divides the brain into various lobes. So this entire lobe that is anterior is called the frontal lobe. And you should know the basic function of these different lobes. The frontal lobe is responsible for your executive type functioning, the thinking, thought process, emotions, etc. It's all processed in the frontal lobe. So your executive functioning. Over here, posterior to the central sulcus, this is the parietal lobe. Again, it's also named because it follows the contours of the parietal bone. Now, where's the occipital lobe? Well, there's no clear demarcation, but somewhere around here, that's the occipital lobe, maybe actually a little bit further back, in fact. So let's erase that. It's probably around here somewhere. Yeah, that looks better. So that's the occipital. The occipital lobe is so named because it underlies the occipital bone itself, and the occipital lobe is where the visual cortex is present over there. Lastly, we have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is most associated with learning. Hearing, sorry, not learning. Learning, that would be the frontal lobes. In fact, all the lobes, whenever you generate any memories, that would be throughout the cerebral cortex. But the temporal lobe is most responsible for, or most associated with hearing. Again, most likely because the ear is located right here. So that's it in terms of the different lobes of the brain. And so you need to identify the central sulcus, and then you'll be able to identify the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe is right at the back, and then the temporal lobe over here. This is called this little sulcus over here is known as the lateral sulcus. So the lateral sulcus divides the frontal/parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. Over here in this image, you can see that the lobes are color-coded, so it really makes it easy. But firstly, once more, you have to define where the central sulcus is. So here's the central sulcus. You can see it goes all the way to the other side as well. So that's the central sulcus. It's the only sulcus that goes really all the way from one end to the other end. You pick any of the other sulcus, you can see it ends in a dead end, so to speak. The central sulcus is the only one that goes that. So all this is the frontal lobe. Everything in red, everything in green is the occipital lobe. This in yellow is the temporal lobe. This structure is obviously the cerebellum. What does the cerebellum do? Motor coordination. So whenever you learn to ride a bike and so forth, that little piece of program is stored in the cerebellum. So if you have any cerebellar disorder, that will manifest itself as a motor disorder. You won't be really able to walk properly, for example. So cerebellum is responsible for motor coordination. So we've looked at the different lobes over here. Oops, there's just the parietal lobe here in blue. So once more, you need to identify what the different lobes do. The frontal lobe is responsible for executive functioning. The occipital lobe is where the visual cortex is located. The temporal lobe is where you have the auditory cortex, somewhere around here. The parietal lobe is responsible for a whole variety of things, including learning, for example. And then the cerebellum, which is not part of the actual cortex, is responsible for motor coordination. Two other features that I want to highlight over here, in that this little gyrus that is just anterior to the central sulcus is called the motor cortex, and this little gyrus over here in dark blue, so to speak, is the sensory cortex. So the motor cortex is responsible for receiving information, or rather sending information down to the skeletal muscles of the body. So say you want to move your arm. The thought initially originates, say it's a voluntary movement, the thought originally originates in the frontal lobe. From the frontal lobe, it will be transmitted to the motor cortex, and then from the motor cortex, it will be transmitted down the spinal cord to your biceps brachii through one of the spinal nerves, and then the muscle will contract. So the motor cortex is responsible for coordinating the contractions of the skeletal muscles of the body, the voluntary skeletal muscles of the body. The sensory cortex, on the other hand, is responsible for receiving, no surprise, the afferent sensory information from various parts of the body, specifically the skin. So you touch a table or whatever the case might be, that sensory information is transmitted from your fingertips to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, it rises or ascends the spinal cord to the thalamus. The thalamus is in the midbrain. in the central part of the cerebral cortex. We can't have a look at it in this view. We'll have to dissect it through the sagittal section to have a view of the thalamus. But the thalamus is the relay center of the body. So all the sensory information first comes to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus it gets projected to different parts of the cerebral cortex. In this case, from the thalamus, that sensory information is projected to the sensory cortex, and then from the sensory cortex it is then projected to different parts of the brain so that that sensory information can be interpreted. Here's a sagittal view of the brain. Once more, we can define the different lobes. Here's the central sulcus. All that in red is the frontal lobe. So you can see the frontal lobe is really large. No surprise, it's responsible for all the executive functioning of the body. Here's the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, that's the inside view of the temporal lobe. And you can see the temporal lobe continues also on this inside part. That's got a different name. That's called the cingulate lobe, but that doesn't really matter. But in this view, we get a better look at the inner structures of the brain. So this little structure over here, you can see, is all white matter, and that's the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum myelinated white matter that connects the two cerebral hemispheres. We all know that we have two cerebral hemispheres, the left and right, and what connects it is the corpus callosum. So that enables information to travel back and forth from one hemisphere to the other hemisphere. A couple of other structures that we need to identify. This, right in the center over here, is the thalamus. And the thalamus is the main relay center of the brain. Over here we have the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is really involved in the autonomic nervous system. So we'll be describing the hypothalamus in more detail when we do the endocrine system, as well as when we do the autonomic nervous system. So especially the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus releases a whole bunch of different hormones that will travel down to the pituitary gland, which is really not shown here, but here's the general location of the pituitary gland. We can see part of it, but not all of it. The hormones travel down the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland releases various hormones that affect the various target organs of the body. So that's pretty much about it that you need to worry about in this particular view. On this view of the lateral side of the brain, we have color-coded the different functional areas of the brain. So we looked previously at the different lobes of the brain and roughly what they're responsible for. Over here, we're going to go into a little bit more specific detail about the functional areas of the brain. So let's start off. This over here is called the Broca motor speech area. It is responsible for, no surprise, the ability to form words, to articulate words in the motor sense of it. So if you have a stroke, especially in the left hemisphere, and it affects this particular area, the Broca area over here, what you will end up with is something known as Broca's aphasia. Aphasia is the lack of ability to communicate or to talk. When the stroke injures the frontal regions of the left hemisphere, language problems can occur. That part of the brain is responsible for, the Broca area is responsible for putting together complete sentences. So injury to this left frontal area can lead to what's called Broca's aphasia. And that means that you have great difficulty forming complete sentences. You may be able to get out some basic words to get your message across, but leave out words like is or the. And then often these people with Broca's aphasias, these clients or patients with Broca's aphasias, often will say something, but it doesn't resemble a sentence, and then you'll have trouble understanding sentences and so forth. So it is the expressive part of speech that is affected, the motor speech that is affected if there's a stroke in that particular region. Remember, a stroke is when you cut off blood supply to that region, so especially in the left hemisphere, and when it affects the Broca motor speech area, you'll end up with what is known as Broca's aphasia, difficulty forming complete sentences. On the other hand, these two areas over here, actually all three areas, but it's mainly this area over here, that's called Wernicke's sensory speech area. And that is responsible for the sensory perception of speech. So if you have a stroke in that particular region and it affects the Wernicke sensory speech area, then the type of aphasia that results is called, no surprise, Wernicke's aphasia. And often the clients or patients will say many words that don't make sense. So they can articulate, but they can't comprehend that speech, though the speech doesn't really make any sense. So they say words that don't make sense. They may fail to realize that they're saying the wrong words. So instead of, calling that a fork, you might call it some nonsensical word, a gibel or something like that. And then they can also string together meaningless words that sound like a sentence but don't make sense. So in other words, they can articulate the words, but the words don't have any meaning because the Wernicke sensory speech area has been affected. They can't put it into context. They string together words, but it doesn't make any sense. Next, this particular area, it's actually both here and here, that's called the auditory cortex. So the hearing is detected by the sensory receptors in the cochlea, and from there it's transferred through the cochlear nerve, which is part of the vestibular cochlear nerve, to this particular area where it is then processed and then it's sent on to other parts of the brain to be interpreted. So that's the primary and secondary auditory cortex. So all the hearing impulses are sent to this area to be interpreted into and converted into speech. For example, if someone was talking. So that's the auditory cortex. Over here, no surprise, that's the visual cortex. So all the sensory information from the retina travels through the second cranial nerve, the optic nerve, and then it projects back into this visual cortex, where those action potentials are then analyzed and an actual image is formed from all that information. We've also seen these two areas previously. This is the motor cortex, and that's the sensory cortex. So all the sensory or afferent information is transmitted first to the thalamus, which is the main relay center of the brain, and then to the sensory cortex, whereby you can localize that sensation and then interpret it by projecting it to the frontal lobe. Similarly, the motor cortex is where the information is first, say if it's a voluntary contraction of a muscle, first originates the thought in the frontal cortex, and then it is projected to the motor cortex, and from the motor cortex, each particular region of the motor cortex is responsible for moving a particular part of the muscle of the body. So this particular large areas are devoted to, for example, moving the tongue. Smaller areas are responsible for moving your back muscles, for example. So the information is projected to a particular part of the motor cortex, and then from there down through the spinal cord to the actual muscle group that is to be contracted. This particular area that is just roughly shaded red is what's known as the motor association area. So information regarding the contraction of the muscle is also kind of processed in this motor association area. Similarly, there's a sensory association area just posterior to the sensory cortex. More information about these different areas, functional areas of the brain, can be found in the textbook. Remember, we are just doing a basic overview here using the diagrams. Here's a sagittal section of the brain, a couple of structures that we can identify over here. All this is the corpus callosum that enables communication between the two hemispheres of the brain. Right in the center over here, that's the thalamus. That's the main relay center of the brain for sensory information especially. Here's the hypothalamus, which is involved in the endocrine system. And then we get a look at the different parts of the midbrain and ultimately the spinal cord itself. Firstly, here's the cerebellum, which is responsible for the motor coordination. So let's look at the different parts of the brain stem. This is the midbrain, which has various structures. We won't get into the details of that. Here is the medulla oblongata that contains all the vital centers of the body, the respiratory center, the cardiovascular, cardioacceleratory, cardioinhibitory centers. So if you damage the medulla oblongata, death will immediately result because it controls both your heart rate as well as your breathing. And this is the pons. And all this will be continuous with the spinal cord. And that's really the only structure that you need to worry about. In a bit, we will see that there's also what's known as the ventricular system of the brain. The brain itself has various chambers that are filled with fluid, cerebrospinal fluid to be more precise, and the fluid is moving around those chambers. One thing to lighten the head itself, and secondly to help to wash away all the debris that is formed in this very metabolically active organ. In the rest of the body, what washes away all the dirt and debris and all that is the lymphatic system. The brain doesn't have any lymphatic system, so it has another system of fluid circulating throughout called the cerebrospinal fluid, and that circulates in the ventricles. So we can't really see the ventricles over here. We can see a couple of them. We can see the main lateral ventricles, although it kind of has this particular shape. It's horn shaped over here. And then that from the lateral ventricle, it flows to the third ventricle. The third ventricle is in roughly the same position as the thalamus. In fact, the thalamus is right on the midline, and the third ventricle is on either side of the thalamus. From the third ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid flows down this aqueduct over here into the fourth ventricle. So this we can see is the fourth ventricle. And then from the fourth ventricle, it can flow into the rest of the brain, which we can't really see over here, but there is an opening that goes around here and then through the rest of the brain. And also from the fourth ventricle, you can travel down through the spinal cord. And when you do a lumbar puncture, for example, to sample the cerebrospinal fluid, that's what you're doing. You're sampling the fluid in the spinal cord. So there are a whole variety of reasons that you would want to sample the cerebrospinal fluid, including the detection of meningitis, for example. But so you wouldn't want to stick a big needle right into the brain to get the CSF. Instead, you will just stick it in between the vertebra and to try to sample the cerebrospinal fluid in the spinal cord, because remember, it is continuous with the rest of the ventricles of the brain. Here's another view of the sagittal section of the brain in a more intact specimen, so to speak. So all this is the cerebral cortex. You can see the cerebellum over here. All that is the cerebral cortex, as I said. Here is the corpus callosum. Here's the hypothalamus. You can't really see the thalamus because it's right on the midline over here, but this is roughly the region of the thalamus over there. It's better viewed on a transverse section over there. Midbrain, medulla oblongata, and that's the pons. And obviously here's the spinal cord. Various other structures we can see, but those are really associated with the respiratory system, with digestive system. Here's the tongue, here's the nose with the nasal conchae, etc. So we're not going to do that. But one thing I'd like to just highlight over here is the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. So here's roughly the same thing. Remember, the thalamus is right on the midline, and then on either side is the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is right here, flows down the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, and then from the fourth ventricle it can flow right over here in the subarachnoid space. So we'll look at the meninges in a second, or the coverings of the brain, but that's where the cerebrospinal fluid flows. It can also flow down into the spinal cord. So it's all a one continuous system. And remember, the cerebrospinal fluid is there to nourish the brain as well as to wash away all the debris that accumulates in this metabolically active organ that is really awake all times, right? We might be asleep, but the brain is busy cementing all the activities that it learned in the previous days, throwing out all the unwanted thoughts and memories, and so forth. So the brain really doesn't sleep. We all know that the brain is covered in various layers that are known as the meninges. So here's a really awesome dissection that shows you the different layers, which we'll start labeling right now. So here we have the skin. When you remove the skin, you get to the muscle layers. So there's the frontalis muscle, and all this is really just a thin tendon sheath. It's called the aponeurosis, but we don't need to worry. We'll just call it a thin tendon sheath over there. This is the periosteum. Oops, sorry. Oh, the outer covering of the skull, made up of fibrous connective tissue. Here's the skull itself, the skull bone. And now we get to the layers of the brain, the coverings of the brain. This particular outermost layer is called the dura mater. Mater is Latin for mother because it protects the brain. And then we can't really see the other two layers. We can just see the shiny surface on the brain. So there are two other layers over here called the arachnoid plus pia mater. right? So the arachnoid and pia layers over there. So you can't really see it because it's tightly attached to the brain. Here's a different view of the different layers of the meninges, which will again label. Here's the skin. This is the skull bone. Here's the dura mater. So this gives you an insight as to how thick the dura mater really is. So the dura is a really thick layer made up of fibrous connective tissue. This layer is a space really that is called the subarachnoid space, and you can see it has tiny blood vessels, especially the arterial blood supply that runs in the subarachnoid space. And then we have the two layers over here, so you can just barely see. The arachnoid layer also is directly attached to the brain, so all this is the arachnoid layer, and it really runs through one gyrus to the next gyrus. It doesn't really follow into the sulcus, but in this case, probably just the way the specimen has been prepared, you can't really see that. But the arachnoid layer covers the entirety of the brain in that particular manner, but it doesn't go into the sulcus, so to speak. The pia mater, on the other hand, really does, as you can see over here, the pia mater is like that little saran wrap that you have, which you wrap your vegetables and all that stuff, food stuff with. It completely tightly adhered to the surface of the brain. You can't remove it really, and it follows every contour of the brain, including going right into the sulcus. So that's the pia mater over there. So once more, going from superficial to deep, you have the dura mater, then the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. Or from deep to superficial, pia mater, arachnoid mater, and then the dura mater. In this particular image of the intact brain, everything has been removed, including the dura mater, but what remains is the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So this gives you a better view of the arachnoid mater. You can see how it traverses all the different sulci of the brain, but doesn't really go into it. So here's, you're really getting a good view of the arachnoid layer, or the arachnoid mater. The pia mater would be deep to that, and remember the dura mater has been removed completely because the dura mater is a very, very thick layer, brownish layer that covers the entirety of the brain. When you do cranial surgery, as we saw in the previous slides, you have to literally cut through the dura mater to see the cerebral cortex. Here's a different view. On here, the hemisphere, in this case the right hemisphere, is still covered by the arachnoid mater, but the left hemisphere we've stripped off all the meningeal layers. So now you get a good view of the cerebral cortex. Here we have the meningeal layers still on, except for the dura mater. The dura mater has been removed because the dura mater is like having a brown piece of paper wrapping the entire brain. You wouldn't even see the brain over there. Since we're on this view over here, let's again identify this particular sulcus. You can see how it goes all the way across. That's, yes, the central sulcus. So we can actually identify the different lobes. That's the frontal lobe. All this is the parietal lobe, and here roughly is the parietal, and this is the occipital lobe over that. So as you can see, this central sulcus is really important, and once you identify the central sulcus, you can also identify the motor cortex. That's the first gyrus, this anterior to the central sulcus, and that's the sensory cortex. Over the next couple of slides, I just want to give you a couple of different views of the brain and identify a few more structures that we might have missed. In this view, which is a transverse section through the brain, we can see a couple of features. You can see all the white areas of the brain. That's the white matter. Those are myelinated neurons. Remember, the oligodendrocytes are the neuroglial cells that are responsible for myelination in the central nervous system, not the Schwann cells. The Schwann cells are responsible for myelination in the peripheral nervous system. And then you also see the unmyelinated gray matter over here. So on the surface you really see the gray matter, and right in the center you see the gray matter. And that is the cerebral cortex that is unmyelinated. Typically, the gray matter contain nuclei, and the nuclei are just the origins of the nerve fibers that run to different parts of the brain. Remember, the brain is all interconnected, and there are various nuclei all throughout the brain that are responsible for aggregating the information or transferring the information to the body. One more structure I just want to highlight is this. We saw the dura mater previously, so the dura mater covers the entire brain, but the dura mater also divides the two hemispheres. So we can see the left and right hemispheres over here, and what divides it is really the dura mater over here. This is the dura mater, but because it divides the hemispheres, it's also given another name called the falx cerebri over that. So it literally divides the two hemispheres of the brain. Here's a similar view, except that now we get to see these hollow structures in the brain, and these are the ventricles. And more specifically in this case, this is the lateral ventricle in the right hemisphere, and you can see that there are two lateral ventricles. These two areas over here, these projections over here, are actually the thalamus. And hence, that's really the only time you get a good view of the thalamus. Again, you can see the falx cerebri over here dividing the hemispheres, and on the side of it as well. And then the dura mater covers the rest of the brain over here. All this is the skull, and that's the skin. Let's move on to the next slide. This is really what the ventricles look like. This is on a lateral view. So this is the lateral ventricle, and there's another lateral ventricle on the other side. So this is in one hemisphere, and on the other hemisphere you have another lateral ventricle. Both the lateral ventricles will be ultimately connected to the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle. We have two lateral ventricles, but we only have one third ventricle. The third ventricle is right in the midline of the brain. This little hole over here is for the thalamus, which are on either side, to be connected to each other. So that's the interthalamic stalk, so to speak, that connects the two thalamus on either side of the third ventricle. So the thalamus will be on this side, and then the other thalamus on the other hemisphere will be on the other side, and they're connected through this tiny hole over here. So cerebrospinal fluid is manufactured in, or CSF for short, is manufactured in the lateral ventricles, and then it travels down from the lateral ventricle through this interventricular foramen to the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it travels down this narrow duct called the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, and then from the fourth ventricle it can travel down into the spinal cord and also into the rest of the brain. So it travels round, so to speak, in the subarachnoid space into the rest of the brain over there. So that's the ventricular system of the brain. So I guess we should label it. So that's the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle. And remember that there are really 2 lateral ventricles in each hemisphere. So going back to a different view, this is again a transverse section to the brain. You can see the edges, so to speak, of the 2 lateral ventricles. So in this case over here, it curves round. And if you go back to the previous slide, you can see what we've done is cut in this particular location. Where's my arrow? Little arrow here. What we've done is cut in this plane, so to speak. So you see an opening here, and then all that is missing, and then you see an opening here, over there. That's what we are viewing over here. So that's the lateral ventricle right here, and another lateral ventricle in the other hemisphere. So if I can just point this out. So that's the lateral ventricle, and that continues up, and that's why it's been so to speak cut off. And there's the other part of it, and there's a second lateral ventricle in the other part of it. This little structure over here is called the choroid plexus. That is really what manufactures the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is manufactured by the choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles. Then from the lateral ventricle, it travels to the third ventricle, and then out to the fourth ventricle, and eventually out into the subarachnoid space, as well as into the spinal cord. Here we get a different view again. We're getting closer towards the edges of the lateral ventricle. You can see that the 2 lateral ventricles and a little bit of the edges over there. But we get a better view of the thalamus. So that's the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is the main relay center of the brain. So everything dark over here is the gray matter, everything light is the white matter. You can see the thalamus and all these other structures, the putamen, etc., which we're really not going to get into, made up of gray matter, because they have various nuclei, the origins of the spinal connections, the nervous connection over there. So they contain nuclei of the nerves. That's why they're gray, they're unmyelinated. All these are projections, especially as we saw previously. Oh yes, this is the corpus callosum. That is myelinated because that transmits information rapidly between the 2 between the 2 hemispheres. So that's myelinated, that's white matter, that's the corpus callosum. Here's the other side of the corpus callosum as well. Oopsies, yeah. Sorry about that. That's it for the short overview of the various structures of the brain. I guess not so short anymore. Nevertheless, we went through the different lobes of the brain. We went through a couple of structures of the brain, like the cerebellum, the thalamus, and so forth, sensory cortex, motor cortex. We went through the different functional areas of the brains, the coverings of the brains of the meninges, as well as the ventricular system of the brain. So we did go through all that using a whole variety of images. For more information, please refer back to the narrated slides or the in-class videos. Thanks, have a great day. Bye.